In 1991, an entire family simply vanished in the searing heat of Death Valley. For 22 years, there was nothing. Then, in 2013, a hiker, miles off any marked trail, stumbled upon a half-buried backpack near a forgotten dry riverbed. The nylon was brittle, faded to a ghostly pale blue by decades of sun and sand. Inside, time had taken its toll. A plastic water bottle, warped and melted into an unrecognizable shape. A pair of children's sunglasses, one lens cracked. The tiny cartoon characters on the arms barely visible, and, nestled at the bottom, wrapped in what might have once been a t-shirt, a disposable camera, its cheerful yellow casing caked with grit. No trace of the Martin family, David, Laura, and their 3 young children, Emily, Ben, and Sophie, had ever been found after their minivan was discovered abandoned at a desolate trailhead. It was as if the desert had swallowed them whole. The hiker, a retired geologist named Arthur, knew the stories. Everyone in the small towns bordering the vast national park knew the stories. He felt a chill despite the afternoon heat. What were the chances? He carefully placed the camera in his own pack, a strange weight settling in his gut. Back in civilization, the camera found its way to the Inyo County Sheriff's Department. Detective Miller, a man who'd grown up hearing whispers of the lost family, felt a jolt. The Martin case was legend, a cold file thicker than a phone book, filled with dead ends and the fading hope of a bygone era. A disposable camera, after all this time. Film was fragile. Heat, moisture, decades. It was a long shot. A very long shot. Still, they had to try. The department sent it to a specialist lab in Los Angeles, one of the few places left that still handled such old film with the care it required. The call came a week later. The technician sounded subdued. He said, "We got something. Not much. Most of the roll was ruined, fused together. But the last few exposures, they're faint, damaged, but they're there." A knot tightened in Miller's chest. What would they show? The final moments of a family trip? Or something else? The digital scans arrived by secure email. Miller opened the first one. Grainy, washed out, but unmistakable. David Martin, arm around his wife Laura, both squinting slightly in the sun, a forced cheerfulness in their smiles. Behind them, Emily, the eldest at 10, was making a face at 8-year-old Ben. Little Sophie, just 5, was a blur of motion, halfway out of the frame. It was a typical family photo, the kind taken a million times on a million vacations. Except this one felt different. This one felt like a ghost reaching out. Miller clicked to the next image. Similar. Then the next. And then the final frame. The quality was worse on this one, streaked with chemical decay. The family was clustered together, closer this time, near a distinctive outcrop of striated rock. They were still smiling, but Laura's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Her hand was tight on Sophie's shoulder. David's gaze seemed fixed on something beyond the camera, but it wasn't the family that made Miller lean closer to his screen, his breath catching in his throat. It was what was behind them, half hidden in the deep shadow cast by an overhang of rock, a darker shape in the already dark background. Barely discernible at first, but as he zoomed in, enhancing the pixels, a figure began to emerge, tall, lean, still, watching them. And then Miller saw it, a detail that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The figure appeared to be barefoot. Barefoot, in the punishing terrain of Death Valley. Who was this person? A lost hiker? Or something far more sinister? The photo, instead of offering answers, had just thrown open a door to a dozen new, terrifying questions. The desert had given back a piece of its mystery. But what did it mean? The old case files were pulled from the archives. boxes of them, smelling of dust and forgotten grief. 1991. A different world. No cell phones to trace. No GPS in rental cars. The Martins had driven into Furnace Creek, topped up their gas, bought extra water and snacks. David had spoken to a park ranger, asking about a moderately challenging day hike, something the kids could handle. He'd been given a map, pointed towards a trail that led into a canyon known for its stark beauty. They were last seen by a waitress at a diner, sharing a plate of fries, the kids bickering good-naturedly over the last one. Laura had looked tired, the waitress recalled, but David had been excited, talking about showing the children the real wilderness. Then, nothing. Their minivan was found 2 days later, parked at the trailhead, a half-eaten bag of chips on the dashboard, a child's sun hat on the back seat. The keys were in the ignition. It was as if they'd simply stepped out for a short walk and never returned. The initial search had been massive. Law enforcement, military helicopters, volunteers on foot and horseback. They'd scoured the canyons, the washes, the salt flats. The heat was brutal, even for seasoned searchers. Every day, the hope dwindled. How could 5 people, including 3 children, vanish without a single trace? There were theories, of course. They got lost, succumbed to the elements, an accident, a fall in a remote canyon. Even darker whispers of foul play, though there was no evidence, nothing. Until now, 22 years later, this single grainy photograph. Detective Miller stared at the image of the barefoot man, a phantom in the deep shadows. Was this the key? The missing piece they'd unknowingly searched for all those years ago? The park had its share of eccentrics, recluses who sought refuge in its vast emptiness. Most were harmless. But the figure in the photo didn't feel harmless. It felt like a premonition. He thought of Laura's sister, Sarah. She'd been the one who never gave up, calling the department every year on the anniversary, her voice thinner each time, but her question always the same. Any news? For 22 years, the answer had been no. Now, Miller had to call her. He dreaded it. How do you tell someone that the first glimmer of hope, in over 2 decades, comes in the form of such a disturbing image? What would this do to her, to the fragile peace she might have found? The weight of those 22 years, of the family's silent absence, pressed down on him. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was alive again, and it was already chilling. He picked up the phone. The first step was to try and identify that rock formation. If they could find where that last photo was taken, maybe, just maybe, they could start to unravel what happened in the days or hours that followed. Sarah's voice was hesitant when Miller finally reached her. He'd known her for years, a persistent, quiet grief, her constant companion. He told her about the camera, the photos. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, so profound Miller thought the call had dropped. Then, a shaky breath. "They found a camera?" she whispered. He explained about the final image, the family, the rock formation, and then, reluctantly, about the figure in the shadows. He heard a small sound, a gasp, quickly stifled. "A man?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Watching them?" He confirmed it was unclear, that it could be anything, but the implication hung heavy between them. He told her they were trying to locate the spot. "I want to see it," she said, a new firmness in her tone. "The photo. I need to see it." Miller knew he shouldn't. Not yet, not until it was part of a more formal briefing, but he also knew he couldn't refuse. He owed her that much. He owed the Martins that much. He arranged for her to come in the next day. The photograph was sent to geologists, to veteran park rangers, anyone who might recognize the specific strata and shape of the rock. Days turned into a week. The image was grainy, the angle tricky. Several promising leads turned out to be false alarms, similar formations but not an exact match. The pressure was mounting. The media had gotten wind of the camera, and suddenly the Martin family disappearance was headline news again. A forgotten tragedy resurrected. Speculation was rampant. Was it a cult? A lone madman? An innocent bystander misidentified? The barefoot detail caught the public imagination, a symbol of something wild, untamed, potentially dangerous. Miller found himself looking over his shoulder more often, the vast, silent desert feeling less like a backdrop and more like an accomplice. He reread the original witness statements. The waitress who saw them last, the park ranger who gave David the map. Nothing new jumped out, just ordinary people recalling ordinary moments before the extraordinary void. Had David mentioned any change of plans? Any specific, less common trail he was curious about? No one remembered anything like that. They were just a family, excited for an adventure, swallowed by a landscape that offered breathtaking beauty and mortal danger in equal measure. The other photos on the roll, the ones taken before the final, ominous shot, were heartbreaking in their normalcy. Ben making a silly face, covered in chocolate ice cream from a stop earlier in their trip. Emily proudly holding up a rock she'd found. Sophie asleep in the car, her head pillowed on Laura's lap. Laura smiling tiredly at David as he drove. Each image was a small stab of grief for a life unlived, for moments that became unknowingly precious. And then the call came. A retired park geologist, now living in Arizona, thought he recognized it. "It's remote," he said, his voice crackling over the phone. "Not a place people go. Off trail, deep in what we used to call Badwater Basin's desolate heart. There's a reason it's not on tourist maps." He gave them coordinates, a description of how to approach it, a warning about the treacherous terrain, a place people don't go. Why had the Martins gone there? Or had they been led? The rock formation had a name, an old one, unofficial, the Sentinel, as if it had been standing guard over a secret all these years. The new search was on. A small team was assembled. Miller, 2 experienced deputies, a search and rescue coordinator familiar with Death Valley's unforgiving landscape, and a forensic photographer. Sarah had pleaded to go, but it was too dangerous, too uncertain. Miller promised to keep her updated every step of the way. She gave him a small, worn photograph of Laura, her sister, smiling, young and vibrant. "Find them, detective," she'd said, her eyes filled with a pain that 22 years hadn't erased. "Please, just find out what happened." The weight of that plea settled heavily on Miller as they loaded their gear into the 4-wheel drive vehicles. They drove as far as the rugged track would allow, then continued on foot, the sun already climbing, promising another scorching day. The air was still, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gravelly soil and the occasional call of a raven circling overhead. The landscape was brutal, a kaleidoscope of browns and grays, rock formations twisted into grotesque shapes by millennia of wind and erosion. It felt like another planet. The retired geologist's directions were precise. After several hours of hard hiking, navigating by GPS and old-fashioned map and compass skills, they saw it. Rising from a desolate canyon floor, unmistakable, the Sentinel. It was exactly as it appeared in the photograph. The same striations, the same distinctive overhang. A chill ran down Miller's spine despite the oppressive heat. They were here. This was the place. The place where the Martin family had stood, smiling for a camera, unaware of the shadow lurking behind them, unaware that their lives were about to change forever, or end. The forensic photographer began taking pictures, documenting everything, while the others fanned out, their eyes scanning the ground. They moved slowly, methodically. What were they looking for? Signs of a struggle? Discarded belongings? Graves? The sheer scale of the desert was daunting. Anything could be hidden here, buried by shifting sands, baked by the relentless sun until it was unrecognizable. They focused on the area around the base of the sentinel, the spot where the family had likely stood. The ground was hard-packed, scoured by wind. Decades had passed. What could possibly remain? One of the deputies, a young man named Harris, called out, his voice tight. "Sheriff, over here." He was crouched near a cluster of boulders, a few yards from the sentinel. He pointed. At first, Miller saw nothing but sand and rock. Then, Harris carefully brushed away a thin layer of grit. A small patch of color, faded but still visible. Blue. Denim blue. He used an evidence marker to indicate it, then, carefully, with tweezers from his kit, began to excavate around it. It was a piece of fabric, small, no bigger than his palm, deeply embedded in the soil. It looked like it had been torn from something. Miller thought of the photos of the children, what they'd been wearing. Ben had been wearing denim shorts. His heart hammered. This tiny scrap, after all this time, it felt monumental. It suggested they hadn't just vanished from this spot. Something had happened here, or very near here. The fabric was too fragile to examine closely on site. It would go to the lab. But it was a lead, the first tangible thing, apart from the camera, that connected the Martins to this desolate place. The discovery of the fabric changed the atmosphere. The silence of the desert suddenly felt more oppressive, more watchful. Was the barefoot man's presence just a coincidence? A trick of the light in an old photo? Or was that torn piece of denim a testament to something violent, something terrifying, that had unfolded right where they stood? They expanded the search grid, inch by painstaking inch. Every rock shadow, every crevice, every dip in the terrain now seemed to hold a potential secret. The sun beat down, and the hope that had flickered with the discovery of the camera began to mingle with a growing dread. What else would this place give up? The discovery of the denim scrap, small as it was, sent a ripple of grim confirmation through the team. It was sent immediately for analysis, but Miller didn't need a lab to tell him what he suspected. It was almost certainly from Ben Martin's clothing. The color, the texture, matched the descriptions from 1991. It suggested a struggle, or at least a moment of physical distress. Why else would a piece of a child's shorts be torn and left here, half buried in the dirt? The search team, now more focused, began to work outward from the sentinel and the spot where the fabric was found. They were looking for anything out of place, anything that spoke of human presence beyond a fleeting visit. The figure in the photo, the barefoot man, loomed large in their minds. Had he lived out here? Was this his territory? Park records from the early 90s were combed through again. Reports of vagrants or individuals living off-grid were sparse. Death Valley was too harsh for most, even the desperate. But there were a few mentions, fleeting sightings of a tall, solitary man, sometimes seen at a distance by hikers in the more remote southern regions of the park. He was always described as gaunt, elusive. No name, no positive identification. He was more legend than reality, a desert phantom. Could he be the man in the photo? And if so, what became of him? Did he simply melt back into the wilderness, or was his fate somehow tied to the Martins' hours passed under the relentless sun? The team members, though professionals, felt the psychological strain. The silence, the vast emptiness, the knowledge of what had likely happened here. It gnawed at them. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. It was Deputy Harris again who found the next sign. He'd been meticulously examining a jumble of rocks and scrub brush 100 yards from the sentinel, an area slightly more sheltered from the prevailing winds. "Sheriff," he called, his voice strained. "You need to see this." Hidden behind a large boulder, almost invisible until you were right upon it, was a crude opening. It wasn't a natural cave, more like a deep recess under a pile of fallen rocks, perhaps deliberately enhanced. A narrow entrance, dark and uninviting. It smelled faintly of dust, decay, and something else, something vaguely animalistic, or perhaps just old confined air. Miller felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This wasn't on any map. This was hidden. He shone his flashlight into the opening. It was shallow, not much deeper than 10 or 15 feet, and low-ceilinged, but it was undeniably a shelter. And it looked like it had been used. There were signs of habitation, though very old. A few rusted cans, labels long gone. Some tattered, unidentifiable material that might have been bedding. And then, in the far corner, something else, something small. Miller squeezed through the narrow opening, his heart pounding. The air inside was stale, heavy. He directed his flashlight beam. Lying in the dust, partially covered by a flat piece of rock as if deliberately hidden, was a child's toy. A small plastic horse, the kind that came in cheap playsets. Its paint was faded, one leg broken, but it was unmistakable. He remembered the inventory of items Laura Martin had said Sophie, the youngest, always carried with her. A beloved, ratty teddy bear, and her collection of little plastic animals. Sophie rarely went anywhere without at least one. This horse, here, in this desolate, hidden hole. The implications were sickening. This wasn't just a chance encounter anymore. This wasn't just a family getting lost. The discovery of the camera had been a shock, the photo unsettling. The fabric scrap had been a grim confirmation. But this toy, in this place, this spoke of something far darker. It suggested the Martins, or at least one of them, had been in this crude shelter. Why? Were they brought here? Did they seek refuge here? And who else had been here with them? The barefoot man from the photograph? Was this his den? The questions swirled, each one more horrifying than the last. The mid-story spike had arrived, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating discovery of a child's lost toy in a place where no child should ever have been. The desert was slowly, cruelly, giving up its secrets. The discovery of Sophie Martin's plastic horse in the crude shelter cast a pall over the investigation. This was no longer about a family lost to the elements. This was something else, something sinister. The shelter itself became the focus. Forensic specialists were called in, flown by helicopter as close as possible and then hiking the rest of the way. They began a meticulous examination of the dusty floor, the rock walls, every inch of the cramped space. It was slow, painstaking work. What were they looking for? Fingerprints? DNA? Anything that could identify who had used this place and when. The rusted cans were carefully bagged. The tattered fabric, possibly bedding, was collected. Even the dust itself was sampled. Detective Miller watched them work, a knot of cold anger and profound sadness in his chest. He thought of little Sophie, her bright smile in the earlier photos on the camera roll, now contrasted with the grim reality of her toy, found in this desolate hovel. What terror must she have felt? What must they all have endured? Sarah was informed of the discovery. Miller made the call himself. He heard her breath hitch, then a long, ragged sob. Sophie's horse? She finally managed to say, her voice broken. Oh God, no. The toy, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things, was a powerful symbol. It made the horror personal, tangible. It was a direct link to the child, to her innocence, lost in this brutal place. While the forensics team worked, others continued to search the area around the shelter. Was there anything else? Any other sign of the family? Any clue to the identity of the barefoot man? The shelter was on slightly higher ground, overlooking a wide, barren wash. If someone lived here, they would have had a commanding view of the surrounding area, able to see anyone approaching from a long way off. Days passed. The lab results started to trickle in, but they were frustratingly inconclusive. The cans were too old, too degraded to yield prints. The fabric bedding was contaminated, offering no clear DNA profile. Time and the harsh desert environment had erased much of what might have been there. But then, one of the forensic techs, carefully brushing away dust from the rock wall at the back of the shelter, found something. Carvings. Crude, almost childlike, scratched into the soft sandstone. They were faint, easily missed, but as they were carefully highlighted and photographed, a disturbing pattern emerged. There were several small, stick-like figures, 5 of them, and then a larger, more dominant figure, often drawn standing over them, or apart from them, watching. Sometimes, the larger figure was depicted with what looked like long, wild hair, and in one carving, its feet were noticeably large and ill-defined, almost as if emphasizing their bareness. Interspersed with these figures were other symbols, stranger ones, spirals, jagged lines, things that looked like eyes. It was like a primitive, nightmarish story scrawled on the rock. Were the 5 small figures the Martins? Was the larger figure their tormentor, the barefoot man from the photo? The psychologist attached to the investigative team studied the images. "This suggests a disturbed individual," she said, her voice grim. "Someone with a sense of power, of control over others. The repetition of the figures, the watcher motif, it's unsettling. It speaks of obsession." The carvings offered no direct answers, but they painted a chilling psychological portrait of whoever had inhabited this lonely place. And it seemed increasingly likely that this person had encountered the Martin family. The question was no longer if they had met, but what had happened when they did. The shelter, once a place of potential answers, now felt like a tomb, its secrets etched into the very stone, a silent testament to an unimaginable horror. The team felt it. The weight of the place, the story it was beginning to tell, and they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that they were not yet at the end of it. There had to be more. The crude carvings in the shelter intensified the search for the identity of the barefoot man. Investigators redoubled their efforts, cross-referencing old park ranger logs, police reports from surrounding counties, even psychiatric hospital records from the late 80s and early 90s. They were looking for anyone matching the vague descriptions of the elusive desert dweller, anyone with a history of erratic behavior or violence who might have been in Death Valley around 1991. The net was cast wide. Days of painstaking research yielded a tentative lead. A name: Silas Blackwood. He was a drifter, a man in his late 40s at the time, with a history of minor offenses, trespassing, vagrancy, and a rumored preference for living wild. He'd been known to frequent the desolate fringes of national parks across the Southwest. Several unconfirmed sightings had placed him in the Death Valley area during the spring and summer of 1991. He was described as tall, thin, with long, unkempt hair, and often seen barefoot or in crude, homemade sandals. He matched the shadowy figure in the photograph. And, crucially, Silas Blackwood had seemingly vanished himself sometime in late 1991. No record of him existed after that summer. Had he simply moved on, or was his disappearance connected to the Martins? The thought was chilling. Was he a victim too? or the perpetrator who then fled. The search team on the ground, armed with this new information, felt a renewed, if grim, sense of purpose. They expanded their search radius from the shelter, looking for any other signs of Blackwood's presence, or any indication of where the Martins might have gone after their encounter at the Sentinel and their apparent time in or near the shelter. The terrain was incredibly difficult. Canyons narrowed into tight, slot-like passages. Rockfalls had altered the landscape over the decades. What might have been a passable trail in 1991 could be completely obliterated now. One of the search and rescue coordinators, an old-timer named Jeb, who knew these desolate corners of the park better than anyone, pointed towards a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the rock face. Not far from the shelter but hidden by a thicket of thorny bushes and a tumble of boulders. If someone wanted to hide something, or someone, Jeb said, his voice raspy, or if they wanted to lead folks where they couldn't easily be followed, they might use a place like that. It looked impassable. A dark crack, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Miller felt a familiar dread. "Has this ever been explored?" he asked. Jeb shook his head. "Not to my knowledge. Too tight. Too dangerous. Most folks wouldn't even see it." But the carvings in the shelter depicted the small figures being led, or herded. And the dominant figure seemed to know the land. If Silas Blackwood was the barefoot man, and if this was his domain, he would know all its secret places. They had to look. Two of the slimmest team members, roped for safety, were chosen to try and enter the fissure. The opening was claustrophobic. They disappeared into the darkness, their helmet lamps casting small, dancing circles of light. Their voices, when they radioed back, were tight with tension. "It opens up a bit after about 20 feet, one of them reported. "It's a narrow passage, like a tunnel. We can see something ahead, debris, or something else." Miller and the others waited. The silence stretched taut. What would they find in this hidden crack in the earth? Hope for answers mingled with the terrifying possibility of finally uncovering the Martins' fate. The minutes crawled by. Then the radio crackled again, the voice strained, almost breathless. "Sheriff, you need to get in here. We've found something. I think we've found them." The words, "we've found them," hung in the oppressive desert air, a chilling pronouncement that everyone had dreaded and, in some dark way, expected. Getting more personnel into the narrow fissure was a challenge. It was a tight squeeze, the rock abrasive, the darkness absolute beyond the reach of their lights. The passage twisted, then opened into a slightly larger chamber, not a cave in the true sense, but a void within the rock, perhaps 10 feet wide and 20 feet long, with a low, sloping ceiling. The air was thick, stale, and cold, a stark contrast to the baking heat outside. And there, in the dim light of their flashlights, they saw them, skeletal remains, scattered, partially buried by rockfall and time. The silence in the chamber was profound, broken only by the ragged breathing of the search team. It was a scene of utter desolation. A makeshift grave, hidden deep within the earth. The forensic team, working with extreme care in the cramped conditions, began the grim task of documentation and recovery. It was immediately apparent there were multiple individuals. Small bones indicated the presence of children. The emotional toll on the team was immense. These were not just bones, they were the Martin family, lost for 22 years. Now found in the most horrifying of circumstances. Each carefully unearthed fragment was a piece of a shattered family, a life cut short. The team worked with quiet reverence, their faces grim. They found remnants of clothing, fabric scraps preserved by the dry air, matching the descriptions of what the Martins had been wearing. A small, tarnished metal locket, too corroded to open, was found near where one of the smaller skeletons lay. Laura Martin had worn a locket. As the remains were slowly, painstakingly uncovered, a horrifying count began to emerge. One adult male, likely David. One adult female, likely Laura. Two smaller sets of remains, consistent with Ben and Sophie. 4 bodies. But the Martin family had 5 members. Emily, the eldest daughter, 10 years old at the time of their disappearance. Where was Emily? A frantic, renewed search of the chamber yielded nothing more. Had she somehow escaped, or was she taken elsewhere? The question hung heavy, a new layer of torment added to the already unbearable grief. And what of Silas Blackwood, the presumed barefoot man? Was he among the dead? The initial assessment suggested the 4 individuals found were consistent with the Martin family members, based on age and general characteristics. There was no immediate sign of a 5th adult. This opened up a terrifying possibility. If Blackwood was the perpetrator, had he taken Emily? Or had something else happened to her? Something separate from the fate of the rest of her family in this hidden chamber. The scene suggested a place of finality. There were no signs of a struggle within the chamber itself, but it was impossible to say what had happened before they ended up here. Were they led here and then killed? Did they die of exposure, trapped in this remote place? The cause of death would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to determine after so many years. But the location, so deliberately hidden, so inaccessible, screamed of foul play. The team worked for hours, the silence of the rock around them pressing in. Emerging from the fissure back into the fading daylight felt like returning from another world, a darker, colder one. They had found the Martins, or most of them. But the discovery, instead of bringing closure, had only deepened the mystery and the horror. What happened to Emily? And where was Silas Blackwood? The desert had yielded a terrible secret, but it seemed it was not yet done with them. The remains recovered from the hidden rock chamber were transported to the county coroner's office and then to a specialized forensic anthropology lab. The painstaking process of identification began. Dental records, where available, were compared. Mitochondrial DNA analysis was initiated, comparing samples from the remains to DNA provided by Sarah, Laura Martin's sister. Weeks turned into a month. The waiting was agonizing for Sarah, for Detective Miller, for everyone involved. The public, gripped by the resurrected story, awaited news with a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine sorrow. Finally, the official report came. The 4 sets of remains were, as suspected, David Martin, Laura Martin, 8-year-old Ben Martin, and 5-year-old Sophie Martin. The cause of death, after so many years, could not be definitively determined for any of them. There were some indications of perimortem trauma on David's remains, faint fractures that could suggest a blow to the head, but it was inconclusive. For Laura, Ben, and Sophie, there were no clear skeletal signs of violence. Had they succumbed to exposure, dehydration, or starvation after being trapped or held captive? Or was it something more direct, something that left no trace on bone? The lack of certainty was another layer of cruelty. But the most glaring, most horrifying part of the report was the absence of Emily. The 10-year-old girl was not among the dead found in the chamber, and there was no trace of Silas Blackwood either. The narrative of what happened in 1991 became even more fractured, more terrifying. The prevailing theory now was that Silas Blackwood, the barefoot man in the photo, had encountered the family. Perhaps he had led them, or forced them, away from the main trail towards his hidden shelter. The torn piece of Ben's shorts found near the Sentinel Rock Formation suggested a moment of struggle or coercion early on. Had David tried to resist? Was that when he sustained the injuries? What happened next was a horrifying unknown. Were they held in the shelter? The child's toy, the carvings, they suggested a period of time, however brief, where the family was under Blackwood's control. And then, the hidden chamber. Had Blackwood led them there? Why? To hide them? To imprison them? And what became of him? Did he seal them in and then simply walk away, disappearing back into the vastness of the desert, or to some other state, some other life? Or had he met his own end out in the wilderness, his body never found? The fate of Emily was the most agonizing question. If Blackwood was responsible for the deaths of her parents and younger siblings, what had he done with her? The possibilities were all unthinkable. Had he taken her with him? Had she, by some miracle, escaped the chamber before it was too late, only to perish alone in the unforgiving desert? Or was her fate something else entirely, separate from the main tragedy? The investigation, which had seemed to be drawing towards a grim conclusion, was now thrown wide open again, focused on two missing persons: a 10-year-old girl, lost for 22 years, and a dangerous, disturbed man who might still be out there, or whose bones might also lie undiscovered somewhere in the endless miles of rock and sand. The photograph, the catalyst for this entire renewed search, now held an even more poignant horror: the smiling family, moments from an unimaginable nightmare. The shadowy figure behind them, not just a watcher, but almost certainly an architect of their doom. And Emily, her face bright in that last picture, now a ghost in a story with no end. Sarah, upon hearing the news, was devastated. The confirmation of her sister's death, her brother-in-law's, her youngest niece and nephews, was a blow she had braced for, yet it still shattered her. But the uncertainty surrounding Emily was a special kind of torture, a sliver of impossible hope warring with overwhelming dread. "We have to find her," she whispered to Miller, her voice hoarse with grief. "We have to know. But how do you find a ghost? How do you find a man who was a phantom even when he was alive?" The desert kept its secrets well. The news that 4 members of the Martin family had been found, and that their deaths were likely the result of foul play connected to the elusive Silas Blackwood, sent a shockwave through the small communities bordering Death Valley and resonated across the country. The focus, however, quickly shifted to the two who remained unaccounted for: 10-year-old Emily Martin and Blackwood himself. For Sarah, the confirmation of her family's fate was a grim closure she had long anticipated but never truly prepared for. The funeral services were quiet, attended by a handful of distant relatives and the law enforcement officers who had lived with the case for so long. The 4 caskets, side by side, were a heartbreaking testament to a family adventure that had ended in unimaginable tragedy. But for Sarah, there was no true peace. Emily was still out there. Or her remains were. The not knowing was a constant gnawing ache. Detective Miller officially reopened Emily Martin as a missing person case, now with suspected abduction by Silas Blackwood. Blackwood himself was listed as a wanted fugitive, though many believed he too must have perished in the desert years ago. Yet, without a body, he remained a phantom threat, a dark possibility. The search for Emily and Blackwood continued, but it was a search for needles in a continent-sized haystack. Investigators pored over Blackwood's known history, trying to find any pattern, any clue to where he might have gone if he had survived. Had he ever mentioned family, friends from his past? Any place he might have considered a refuge? He was a ghost, a man who had deliberately erased himself from society long before he encountered the Martins. The desert where the Martins were found was searched again and again. Helicopters with thermal imaging, canine units, teams on foot, they found nothing more. The land was too vast, too wild. It swallowed secrets whole. Years began to pass anew. 2013 became 2014, then 2015. The initial blaze of media attention died down, replaced by the occasional anniversary piece, a cold case update. For Sarah, however, time did not diminish the urgency, the need to know. She became a quiet advocate for missing children, her own grief channeled into a fierce determination to help others avoid her family's fate. She never stopped calling Miller, her questions softer now, tinged with a weary resignation, but always there. Anything on Emily? Anything about him? The answer was always a gentle, regretful no. The final photo from the disposable camera became an iconic, tragic image. It was analyzed and reanalyzed by amateur sleuths online, by profilers, by anyone who thought they could find a new clue in its grainy depths. The smiling family, oblivious. The shadowy, barefoot man, a harbinger of doom, and Emily, caught between innocence and the encroaching darkness. Some held out hope that Emily had somehow survived, that Blackwood, in a twisted moment of mercy or calculation, had let her go, or that she had escaped and been found by someone, somewhere, her identity lost to trauma. But these were faint, desperate hopes, unlikely scenarios. The more probable, and more horrifying, truth was that her fate was tied directly to Blackwood's, and that she too had perished, her resting place still unknown, perhaps mere miles from her family, or 1,000 miles away. The desert held its silence. The Sentinel Rock Formation, where that last photo was taken, became an unofficial, somber landmark. Some hikers left small stones, a flower, a quiet tribute. It was a place of beauty, and now, a place of profound sorrow. The shelter, the hidden chamber, they were eventually sealed by park authorities, out of respect for the dead, and to prevent ghoulish curiosity. But their existence was a scar on the landscape, a reminder of the darkness that could hide even in the most breathtaking of places. The story of the Martin family became a cautionary tale, a whisper in the wind that swept through Death Valley's canyons. A story of a family's dream vacation turned into a nightmare, of a chance encounter with a disturbed soul in the vast, indifferent wilderness. And for Sarah, and for Detective Miller, it remained an open wound, a promise unfulfilled. The search for Emily, and for the truth of Silas Blackwood, continued, a quiet, persistent echo in the silence of the years. The bittersweet resolution was that most of the family had been found, their long limbo over. But the darkness lay in the unanswered questions, in the fate of a lost child, and in the chilling realization that some mysteries may never be fully solved, some wounds may never fully heal. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.